In our segment called In Your Neighborhood, Channel 18 visited the Baptist Home in Ironton. Now, the Baptist Home has a rich history dating back to May of 1913, when the home first opened its doors and received its first occupant. Its founders were Milford and Mary Riggs. Now, life was not easy back in the valley over 100 years ago. Diseases were plaguing the residents of the Arcadia Valley. Transportation and roads were almost non-existent, and difficult times fell on the home. World War I began a few years after the home was constructed, but life went on at the Baptist Home. Hard work was still the rule for all who worked at the home, but the residents were taken very good care of. Then, the Great Depression hit the country. The stock market crashed. Millions of people across the nation lost everything. But the Baptist Home in Ironton continued to exist amidst all of the peril the nation was suffering. Now, let's fast forward to 1953, where John Burney assumes the post as the third superintendent of the Baptist Home. Our cameras went to the Baptist Home in Ironton to visit with Mr. Burney, who is now 104 years young. I sat down with Mr. Burney and asked about life at the Baptist Home.
In 1936, when I came to work, there were a staff of 15, and everybody worked 12-hour shifts, and everybody got a half a day off a week. And everybody got paid $15 a month, except me, and I was getting $25. But it was, they had about 65 residents at the time, and there was very little medical attention given to anybody. The head nurse had never had any formal training. She had simply worked with older people and knew how to appease them and pretty well care for their daily needs. So that's about the way it was when I came to work here. And the staff, all the ladies who were working here lived here. They were given rooms and they lived more or less like the residents. But in those days, the residents were called inmates, and we changed the name to residents later on.
I asked John what gave him the determination to spend so many years at the Baptist Home.
Well, I met my wife here when I first came to work. Coming in the front door, she was coming down the stairway, and she was a nurse aide, and she was carrying a bucket of slop. We had a big farm operation, and we saved the scraps from the tables to feed the hogs. And so she was carrying that down the steps, and I looked at her and I thought, well, she's a pretty girl, so this may not be such a bad place to work after all. So we dated and courted for 8 months, and then we got married. And so we began to have some children, and it just seemed like a better place to be than anywhere else that I knew of. So I stayed. And so I stayed and worked here then 17 years under the superintendent, Dr. Daniel J. Scott. And when he retired, then the board elected me. I didn't want it, but they kept insisting, well, you take it. And I think nobody else wanted it. The reason they wouldn't let me go. And so finally I said, well, okay, if it's a unanimous decision of the board, I will take it and do the best I can. And so I excused myself and went back to the office, closed the door and locked it, and prayed to the Lord that if he didn't want me to have this, please do not make it unanimous. And so pretty soon there was a knock on the door. He tried to get in, but I had it locked. And so I went and opened the door, and he says, the board wants you back in the chapel. They were meeting in the chapel. And I went back up there and they said, "We have elected you superintendent of the Baptist home." It was a unanimous vote. And in addition, we have covenanted ourselves to pray for you and to help you in any way we can. And then somebody made a motion to dismiss, and they dismissed the board meeting, and they all went out and see you next year.
Barney told me that the Baptist home was self-sustaining during his term.
But the farming was, we raised all the beef and produced all the milk and had a large truck patch. Raised a lot of vegetables, beans and corn and potatoes and stuff like that. The first year I was here, I was the bookkeeper, and the total cash expenditure was a little over $13,000. And in those days, churches filled barrels of canned fruit and vegetables and shipped them in, and Missouri Pacific Railroad, they gave us free passage with all of that. And we bought coal from Old Bend Coal Company in Illinois and shipped it in with a carload, parked the car over in the rail yard in Arcadia, and then we'd go over there, the men would, the farm men, go over there in the truck and shovel that coal out of and load up the truck and come back and dump it into the coal bin. And Missouri Pacific didn't charge us for hauling that coal down here.
At one time during John Burney's tenure, he was accredited with saving the Baptist home during some mighty hard times.
When Dr. Scott, I worked under him 17 years, and it just was on a standstill, just wasn't anything happening, just barely enough money to get by. And so that's the way it still was when he retired. And the third floor had never been completed, so that was completed in 1951, and he put out the word, "We can't occupy the third floor till we have more money." And so it rocked along there for a couple of years, and he was just saying, "We're not going to receive any new residents until we have more money." Well, when he retired and left and I was in, we started filling up the third floor, and the response was pretty good. I mean, people began to send money, and we had enough to operate and started saving for a building, and we raised enough money to build that first wing, almost enough before we ever even dug a hole in the ground.
At 104, John Burney is still spry and as full of life as ever. For a place that John Burney once called his workplace, John Burney now calls the Baptist home his home. Fred Dawkins, News Channel 18.